Is the applicant prepared to call its first witness?
We are. And the applicant we call Mark Costa.
Mr. Foss, is this all?
Yeah, I'll get that.
Thank you. Mr. Costa, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Sure. Mark Costa, M-A-R-K-C-O-S-T-A.
Did you provide written testimony in connection with this particular proceeding?
Yes, I did.
On behalf of the applicant?
Correct.
Do you have a copy of that testimony in front of you?
I do.
Did you sign it under oath?
Yes.
And do you adopt that written testimony for the purpose of entering it as your testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Costa is available for cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Mr. Costa.
Good afternoon.
As you know, I'm Rebecca Lacey, and I represent the Weymouth Conservation Commission in this proceeding. And so I'd like to discuss the supplemental pre-filed direct testimony that you filed a couple weeks ago. So just to start, you are responsible for ensuring that the stormwater management design for the proposed Weymouth compressor station project complies with the Massachusetts stormwater standards, correct?
Correct.
In paragraph 6 of your testimony, you quote from the stormwater handbook. And just for the record, I know it's a little bit long, but it's all important. If you could just read that excerpt that's quoted in your paragraph 6.
Mass DEP also recognizes that on some sites, there is a risk that infiltrating the required recharge volume may cause or contribute to groundwater contamination. Consequently, Mass DEP requires infiltration only to the maximum extent practical on the following sites. Sites where recharge is proposed at or adjacent to an area classified as contaminated. Sites where contamination has been capped in place. Sites that have an activity and use limitation, AUL, that precludes inducing runoff to the groundwater, pursuant to MGL Chapter 21E and the Massachusetts Contingency Plan 310 CMR 40. Sites that are the location of a solid waste landfill and defined in 310 CMR 19, and sites where groundwater from the recharge location flows directly towards a solid waste landfill or 21E site.
Thank you. In the proposed compressor station project, to reference the language that you just quoted, recharge is proposed at an area classified as contaminated, correct?
It is adjacent to contamination, correct? Yes.
Is the infiltration basin sited within an area that is classified as contaminated?
Yes.
And similarly, to look at the last part of the quote, which references the 21E site, would you agree that by the same token, recharge at the proposed compressor station, recharge in the proposed compressor station project is proposed into soils that are part of the 21E site?
Correct.
And did you evaluate any alternative stormwater management designs that did not include infiltration into those soils?
Yes.
And were those alternatives presented in any filing with DEP in this proceeding?
No.
Have those alternatives been presented in any filing with DEP?
No.
Did you did you rule out the use of any of those alternatives?
I'm sorry, is there a paragraph number?
I'm still talking about the applicability of the quote from the Stormwater Handbook in paragraph 6. It states, as Mr. Costa quoted, that, sorry. Okay, yes, so let me rephrase my question. The excerpt that you quoted states that infiltration is required only to the maximum extent practicable on the types of sites that are listed in the quote. Did you conclude that what did you conclude about the possibility of alternative stormwater management designs in light of the maximum extent practicable standard?
So we concluded that you could propose a non-infiltrating BMP, so something that's a gravel wetland, as an example. So that would have a liner that would restrict infiltration. You could also think about doing a bioretention basin. Again, that would restrict infiltration. So we evaluated those, and we looked at the treatment removals for infiltration, for the gravel wetland, and subsequently a bioretention basin. So infiltration basins have been reported by the EPA to have 100% removal of total suspended solids, phosphorus, and zinc, which are 3 of the main stormwater contaminants we're worried about. Subsequently, those other BMPs do not have that same treatment removal. They also do not infiltrate stormwater, and therefore you would have a higher rate of runoff and volume of runoff. So as part of the evaluation and to make all reasonable efforts, which the stormwater management guidelines ask you to do for infiltration at a 21E site, that we coordinated and requested the assistance from TRC Environmental and the licensed site professional who's the expert in soil contamination and groundwater contamination. We did a 3-part assessment of that evaluation of infiltrating. The first part was the leachability of the metals and other contaminants, other OHM contaminants. And I should rephrase that. TRC did that evaluation. That evaluation came back saying that those contaminants would not readily leach due to the infiltration basin from soil to groundwater. Then we did a mounding analysis, VHB did, in tandem with a mobility assessment of the LNAPL. I provided the estimated mounding calculations to Jim Doherty, who is now and Kelly Race at the time, the 2 LSPs for the projects, and they subsequently, in tandem with that analysis, did an evaluation that's, in conclusion, noted that the groundwater, the infiltration would not cause or contribute to groundwater contamination to the LNAPL, and essentially that the LNAPL was immobile. So taking all of those into account, that the evaluation completed by both VHB and TRC, that the stormwater infiltration basin wouldn't cause or contribute to groundwater. We wanted to make sure that we were meeting the intent of the stormwater management regulations, which are to make all reasonable efforts to infiltrate. And we wanted to make sure that we were treating stormwater quality at the highest level possible, which would ensure the stormwater quality and the pollutant loading to the Weymouth Ford River, where is the ultimate discharge point. So for all of those factors, that's how we came to our evaluation of an infiltration basin versus a non-infiltrating BMP.
Did you review the activity and use limitation that was recorded by Algonquin for this property and was included in Appendix H of the permanent solution with conditions statement?
No.
So you personally did not evaluate whether or not the stormwater infiltration basin complies with the requirements of the AUF?
No.
In paragraph 8 of your testimony, you state that infiltrating stormwater best management practices are, quote, commonly placed to infiltrate stormwater into fill materials. Is that a correct characterization of your testimony?
Correct.
The footnote to that paragraph references an EPA 2010 document, correct?
Correct.
Does that EPA document discuss infiltration basins cited in fill?
They discuss your land use.
Could you just answer my question specifically? I've read the document, I recognize that it has a lot of information.
In some sense, yes. It's not quite that specific, so it does address your permeability of your soil rates. So the higher permeability that you have, the more water quality you will receive, and the more pollutant removal, or higher pollutant removal that the BMP will receive. So every fill has a permeability rate. So in that sense, it does address the soil characteristics.
But is it fair to say that it does not address whether infiltrating stormwater into contaminated soil achieves the same net pollutant removal?
The basis of the document is to provide pollutant removal rates. I can't quote the entire document to say whether or not it has a specific provision in regards to that.
But you're not aware that it does?
I'm not aware that it does.
And are you familiar with Volume 2, Chapter 2 of the Massachusetts Stormwater Handbook, which is titled Structural BMP Specifications for the Massachusetts Stormwater Handbook?
Yes.
And what does that document say about placing infiltration basins in fill?
The stormwater management regulations do contradict themselves. And within that portion of the document, it says you should not infiltrate into fill. However, Volume 3 of the Stormwater Management Regulations does provide you specific guidance onto how you should evaluate soils and evaluate BMP location, infiltrating BMP locations.
But is it accurate to say that, well, let me back up. Is it accurate to say that Volume 2, Chapter 2 of the Massachusetts Stormwater Handbook provides the design specifications that are required for each of the different types of stormwater management BMPs?
That's a fair assessment.
So isn't it fair to say then that the design specifications for infiltration basins in the Massachusetts stormwater standards say that they should not be placed in fill?
Volume 2 says that, correct.
So what specifically is the basis for your statement in your testimony that infiltrating stormwater best management practices are commonly placed to infiltrate stormwater into fill materials?
I've probably completed 30 to 50 stormwater BMP designs in my career, several through fill, several infiltrating BMPs into fill, maybe in the 20 to 30 range. It's very common. Within our soil strata of Massachusetts, we have a lot of fill, and that's really just the nature of working in eastern Massachusetts, that there's so much fill that if you were to completely eliminate infiltrating BMPs, which is why the stormwater management regulations in volume 3 do provide guidance on how to site an infiltrating BMP into fill, that you would really eliminate a lot of potential throughout the state to introduce these BMPs that are going to do a lot of good and reduce stormwater runoff in volume, so providing flood control, recharging the aquifers in the state, also, and most importantly, your pollutant removals that I discussed earlier that you receive from stormwater infiltration practices.
Have you been involved with any project specifically at another Chapter 21E site in which an infiltration basin has been sited in an area with soil contamination above S2 standards?
Objection. Is there a paragraph that you're asking about?
Sustained.
Yes, the paragraph that I'm asking about is paragraph 8, where he states that these best management practices are commonly placed to infiltrate stormwater into fill materials. And I'm trying to find out, in fact, how common it is, and specifically regarding fill that's contaminated.
Can you re-ask the question, please?
Have you been involved with any project at another Chapter 21E site in which an infiltration basin has been located in an area with soil contamination? And specifically, I'd like to know about soil contamination above S2 standards, but if that's considered outside the scope, any soil contamination, I believe that's within the scope of paragraph 8.
Are you asking the full question or the first part?
Will you allow me?
Break it up into two.
Okay. Have you been involved with any project at another Chapter 21E site in which an infiltration basin has been sited in an area with soil contamination above MCP S2 standards?
I can't answer the question because I am not familiar with the S2 standards.
So, okay, well then let me ask you, have you been involved with any project at another Chapter 21E site in which an infiltration basin has been sited in an area with contaminated soils?
Yes.
And where was that project?
So there's the Beacon Park Yard project, which is in Brighton and Elston, Massachusetts.
And what was the nature of the contamination in the soil?
I forget the specifics.
So to go back to the excerpt from the Stormwater Handbook that you quoted in paragraph 6, that excerpt states that there is a risk that infiltrating the required recharge volume may cause or contribute to groundwater contamination. So is it fair to say that when evaluating whether or not to site an infiltration basin in contaminated soils, you, the stormwater engineer, needs to evaluate whether that infiltration will cause or contribute to groundwater contamination?
As part of a project team, correct, yes.
Are you implying, well,
I'm implying that I'm going to be reliant on a licensed site professional whose expertise is in soil and groundwater contamination.
and what does the phrase cause or contribute groundwater contamination mean to you in the context of the stormwater standards?
I think it's pretty clear.
So, well, so to me, it seems to say that if putting water into a certain portion of soil will result in contamination associated with that soil getting into groundwater, to me that says that the infiltration has caused or contributed to groundwater contamination. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. You'd
So
have to
then-
you'd have to quantify it. You know, I have to quantify.
And so in doing that quantification, what judgment are you making? What amount of groundwater, of causing or contributing to groundwater contamination is acceptable versus not acceptable?
It's not specific, but I'm relying on the licensed site professional to help me with that evaluation and conclusion.
So essentially, you purely rely on whatever the licensed site professional tells you. That is the person that determines whether or not infiltration would, quote, cause or contribute to groundwater contamination?
They make a conclusion, yes. Yes, and I take that information into account with all the different hydraulic and hydrologic parameters that are important within the stormwater management regulations. And through that and the evaluation that I spoke of earlier, that's how we make the decision of going with an infiltrating BMP versus a non-infiltrating BMP.
So in doing your evaluation for the proposed compressor station site, did you factor in both the generic pollutant removal rates associated with infiltration BMPs per the EPA manual? Did you balance that quantitatively with the amount of pollution that you would expect to mobilize from the contaminated fill via that infiltration?
It's not comparing apples to apples. So you take it all into account. You take each piece of evidence that you have, and here I have a licensed site professional telling me that it will not cause or contribute to groundwater. And I understand that Mass DEP's stormwater policy is to make all reasonable efforts to infiltrate. They want you to infiltrate. Why do they want us to do that? Because it provides the highest pollutant removals. It reduces our rate of runoff. It reduces volumes to the Weymouth Ford River. It reduces pollutants to the Weymouth Ford River. So we take all of that into account to make a decision.
How do you know that using the infiltration basin that you designed versus using an alternative that doesn't include infiltration, how do you know that the design that you've chosen reduces pollutants to the Weymouth Ford River in comparison to an alternative that doesn't use infiltration?
The removal rates for an infiltration basin, per the EPA guidance, show 100% removal for infiltration basins. Pollutant removal rates for the gravel wetland alternative that we evaluated that would not infiltrate stormwater would not have as high of removal rates. So therefore, your annual TSS phosphorus and zinc load to the Weymouth Ford River would be higher if you proposed a non-infiltrating BMP.
But that's just using EPA's generic evaluation of infiltration basins, right?
That's using the standard engineering practice in the current standard, which I would say is the EPA guidance document.
But isn't it possible that infiltration into soils with this containing a significant amount of coal ash, isn't it possible that the EPA analysis, the EPA guidance document doesn't correctly characterize the actual pollutant, net pollutant removal from infiltration through that type of soil?
What the EPA is doing is they are testing, and their consultant is testing the outflow from the basin. So they're testing the inflow and the outflow and looking at the contaminants pre and post. So they're not, that EPA guidance does not take into account what the media is, what you're flowing through. It's your surface runoff removal rates.
But doesn't the EPA guidance assume a particular type of matrix for the infiltration basin? It assumes some type of clean, sandy soil?
It assumes a permeability rate.
in paragraph 10 of your testimony, you quote an excerpt from the Stormwater Handbook that states, mounding analysis is also needed when recharge is proposed at a site classified as contaminated, correct?
In so many words, yes.
And it goes on to say that the mounding analysis must determine whether infiltration of the required recharge volume will cause or contribute to groundwater contamination, correct?
Correct.
And you completed a mounding analysis for the proposed stormwater infiltration at the compressor station site, correct?
Correct.
And did you use your mounding analysis to evaluate the potential for the infiltration of the required recharge volume to cause or contribute to groundwater contamination from arsenic?
The arsenic was completed, the evaluation of the leachability of arsenic was completed by TRC.
And did they use the mounding analysis in their evaluation?
From my understanding, no, for the
So
arsenic.
that seems like you haven't met the requirements of the stormwater handbook.
We used, again, a three-pronged approach here.
Okay, but it did not, well, the arsenic evaluation did not actually, the mounding analysis did not factor into the arsenic evaluation, isn't that correct?
No, but the arsenic is not what makes it a 21E site, is my understanding.
Did you, let's see. In paragraph 4 of your testimony, you say that you submit this testimony to address the implications, if any, that the Mass DEP Bureau of Wayside Cleanup Notice of Audit Findings and Notice of Noncompliance may have on my prior analyses and conclusions in support of the project's compliance with the stormwater management standards. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
So have you reviewed the Mass DEP Notice of Audit Findings, Notice of Noncompliance issued in April?
Yes.
And is it your understanding that would it be fair to say that subsequent to the issuance of that Notice of Audit Findings, arsenic has now become a contaminant of concern at the 21E site?
It was always a contaminant of concern. Contaminant of concern.
But you said it's your understanding that that's not what makes it a 21E, that it's not, arsenic doesn't make the site a 21E site. Could you explain that statement?
My understanding was the LNAPL is what made the site a 21E site, and not the already known arsenic.
And is it your understanding that that was changed at all by the Notice of Audit Findings?
My understanding is that's still being evaluated. Or actually, I'd like to say I don't know. You testified that you relied on the analysis by Kelly Race and James Doherty regarding the question of infiltration causing or contributing to groundwater contamination, correct? Yes.
I'd like to look at James Doherty's pre-filed testimony. Do you have that in front of you?
I do not.
I'd like to look at Exhibit 5. So Mr. Dougherty's analysis predicted that infiltration of stormwater in the infiltration basin would cause some arsenic to move from soil into groundwater, correct?
Exhibit 5.
Yes.
I don't feel I'm qualified to speak about Exhibit 5.
Okay, so you relied completely on Ms. Race and Mr. Dougherty to determine whether or not the infiltration basin would cause or contribute to groundwater contamination from arsenic, correct?
Correct.
Is it your testimony that, based on your understanding of the opinions of Ms. Race and Mr. Dougherty regarding arsenic in groundwater at the site, would you say that the phrase, you interpret the phrase, will cause or contribute to groundwater contamination in the stormwater handbook to mean will cause or contribute to a level of groundwater contamination expected to pose a risk to human health or aquatic life?
Can you repeat the question?
So I'll preface this by saying, based on your understanding of the opinions of Ms. Race and Mr. Dougherty, is it your testimony that the phrase, quote, will cause or contribute to groundwater contamination in the stormwater handbook should be interpreted to mean will cause or contribute to a level of groundwater contamination expected to pose a risk to human health or aquatic life?
I have no opinions on that.
So you have no opinion on how to judge what quantity of mobilization of contaminants into groundwater would be acceptable or not acceptable?
Objection. I think he's testified that he relies on an LSP to determine contamination of the groundwater and that it's outside of his expertise.
Well, I
think if he testified about the mobilization, correct?
I'm sorry, are you allowing that? Let me re-ask the question.
Let me ask the question because I think I'm going to allow it.
I don't remember testifying about the mobilization.
If you could re-ask the question. Or do you want the question read back?
No, I can re-ask it. Mr. Costa, are you testifying that you have no basis with which to evaluate what level of mobilization of contaminants into groundwater is acceptable or unacceptable per the stormwater, under the stormwater standards?
It does not quantify a number. It is a qualitative statement that it will not cause or contribute to groundwater contamination.
But I think previously you testified that you have to assess that quantitatively. So there's some quantitative standard. It seems like your analysis assumes that there's some level of mobilization of contamination into groundwater that's okay, and some larger amount is not okay. And I'm just curious if you have any basis for deciding where that cutoff is.
There's no standard. It's a cutoff. It's really on the design professionals and their professional opinion. Here, the LSP has provided, both LSPs that were involved with the project provided that opinion, that it will not cause or contribute to groundwater contamination.
And more specifically, what they're saying is it will not cause or contribute to a level of groundwater contamination that exceeds MCP standards, right? That's what they've opined.
You should ask them.
In your May 22nd testimony, you do not address Stormwater Management Standard 5, is that correct?
I don't believe I discussed it.
But you previously testified in this matter that the proposed project complied with Stormwater Management Standard 5, correct?
I previously testified that, yes.
And does DEP's notice of audit findings, notice of noncompliance affect that opinion in any way?
No.
Is it fair to say that Stormwater Standard 5 requires that land uses with higher potential pollutant loads be protected from exposure to stormwater runoff to the maximum extent practicable?
That's not how I would phrase it.
Okay, I'm going to show you the wetlands regulations. This is an excerpt from 310 CMR 10.05, specifically 10.056A, which discusses the stormwater standards. I'm just going to provide copies for others for reference.
Thank you.
So standard 5 is on page 3 of these 4 pages.
I'm there. You say standard 3 or 5?
Standard 5.
5, okay.
So I'll just read one of the sentences. Here it says, if through source control and/or pollution prevention, all land uses with higher potential pollutant loads cannot be completely protected from exposure to rain, snow, snow melt, and stormwater runoff, the proponent shall use the specific structural stormwater BMPs determined by the department to be suitable for such use as provided in the Massachusetts Stormwater Handbook. Is the infiltration basin, I'm sorry, did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And is the infiltration basin cited in a land use with higher potential pollutant loads as defined in the wetlands regulations?
The land use is a proposed compressor station.
Okay, I think we went over this in the previous hearing.
Objection, then I think we've established that this was not part of his May 22nd testimony.
That's
and that it was
correct.
dealt with previously.
Let's sustain.
Well, what the presiding officer, what I'm trying to get at is why the notice of audit findings doesn't affect his opinion regarding compliance with standard 5.
Ask him that.
Okay. Why does the notice of audit findings not affect your opinion regarding compliance with stormwater standard 5?
Two reasons. The first reason is the proposed land use is a natural gas compressor station. That has not changed as a result of the notice of audit finding. Secondly, we conservatively designed the stormwater management system to comply with standard 5, regardless if it's a LUPL or not a LUPL. And a LUPL is a acronym for land use with higher potential pollutant load. So it's irrelevant.
And the notice of audit findings, you do not conclude from the notice of audit findings that the infiltration basin is cited in a land use with higher potential pollutant loads?
I think I just answered that.
Well, I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. Would you agree that one of the types of land uses with higher potential pollutant loads as defined in the wetlands regulations is an MCP disposal site?
Objection. I think this is beyond the scope of his May 22nd testimony.
I think it's relevant to the question of the notice of audit findings.
Well, he did testify that the NOAF does not change his conclusion. So I think I'm going to allow anyways to probe that a little bit.
Yes, a proposed land use of a disposal site is a listed higher potential pollutant load land use.
Is an existing land use of a disposal site a LUPL?
That question doesn't necessarily make sense. It's your proposed, you're applying for a project. So it's your proposed land use.
Is it your testimony that the disposal site is it your understanding, subsequent to the issuance of the notice of audit findings, that the infiltration basin is sited within a disposal site as defined under the MCP?
Can you repeat the question?
Is it your understanding, subsequent to the issuance of the notice of audit findings, notice of noncompliance, that the infiltration basin should now be considered to be proposed to be sited in within an MCP disposal site?
The basin and the LNAPL were already proposed and already existing prior to the notice of audit findings. So there was already a disposal site prior to that finding.
But I believe in your past testimony, and I can get it out if necessary, but wouldn't you agree that you previously testified that because Ms. Reyes had opined that the fill of the site qualified as historic fill under the MCP, the fill around the infiltration basin was not considered part of the disposal site and was not considered a disposal site?
Objection. I don't believe that that characterizes his testimony accurately.
Sustained, if you could rephrase.
I'm sorry, sustain what?
It's sustained, if you could rephrase the question.
Okay. I'm going to read you a paragraph from your June 2018 testimony, and I'm happy to show you.
I do have a copy.
Okay.
What number?
Paragraph 46.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so in paragraph 46 of your June 2018 testimony, you stated, neither the project's proposed land use as a natural gas compressor station, the historic fill in which the infiltration basin will be sited, or the on-site storage tank qualify the project as a LUPL as defined in 310 CMR 10.04 or in volume 1 of the Stormwater Handbook. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Has that opinion that you expressed in that paragraph changed at all on the basis of the notice of audit findings, notice of noncompliance?
The overall opinion, no.
I'm asking about every aspect of the specific statement that you make in that paragraph. If it has changed in any way, I would like to know your current.
I thought you were asking the conclusion.
Let me ask a question a different way. Is it your understanding that the notice of audit findings, is it your understanding that in the notice of audit findings, DEP's Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup made a finding that the fill at the compressor station site cannot be considered historic fill?
Correct.
So, and isn't it correct that the fill in which the infiltration basin will be sited contains arsenic?
Yes.
So, isn't it the case that based on the notice of audit findings, the infiltration basin is in fact proposed to be sited in a disposal site, and therefore it is a level, that land use is a level?
My understanding is whether or not it's historic fill is still being evaluated. However, as I previously stated,
I'd just like to stop you there. What do you mean that whether or not it's historic fill is still being evaluated?
my understanding is that the Algonquin and Mass DEP are still evaluating that subject.
And what's the basis of that understanding?
Objection. This will get into privileged information, so we would instruct the witness not to answer.
Privileged in what way?
The ongoing investigation related to the NOAF is being done in conjunction with counsel. Counsel has advised on the process. So to the extent he only has information from counsel, we would ask that he not.
Is the information you have received only from counsel for Algonquin? Do you have any independent information to state that?
I've stated everything I know, but no other pieces of information.
I think that the question is, how do you
How do I know that they're still evaluating it?
Yes. Is it from a statement from counsel or from some other source?
It was a statement from counsel.
I'll sustain the objection.
Can I take a 2-minute break? 1 minute break?
1 minute. And I'll just make a note of the time, it's 4:15. We still have Mr. Hayden's cross-examination of Mr. Costa and Mr. Doherty's.
I have no further questions for Mr. Costa.
Mr. Hayden.
Thank you, Ms. Rothschild. All of my intended lines of inquiry were covered by Attorney Lacey. I have no further questions for the witness.
Any redirect? Ms.
Just
Allen?
one question on redirect. You were just asked about DEP's finding in the NOAF related to historic fill, and your answer was cut off. Sure. You were just asked about DEP's, or pardon me, the finding in the NOAF related to historic fill, and you were interrupted in your answer, and so I wondered if you wanted to finish that answer.
It does not change whether or not the site is a level or if it meets the level standard. So again, the proposed land use is a natural gas compressor station, which is not listed as a land use with higher potential pollutant load. Secondly, we've designed the site conservatively to meet standard 5, regardless if it's a level or not.
And does that finding change your opinion about compliance with the stormwater standards?
No.
Why not?
Given that it won't change, well, given that we've conservatively designed the project to meet the level standard, standard 5, the stormwater management system would not change as designed if we were somehow classified as a level.
Can I ask one question on recalls?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that when you say your stormwater design met the requirements for levels, that you're talking about the management of surface stormwater runoff? Or, put it another way. Is it fair to say that your stormwater management design does not consider subsurface soil to constitute a level?
Can you repeat the question?
Is it fair to say that your stormwater management design for the proposed compressor station does not consider subsurface soil to constitute a level?
When defining and formulating my opinion of whether or not the project is a land use with a higher potential pollutant load, I reviewed all the land uses that are listed within.
Okay, I think this is a yes or no question.
Could you repeat the question?
Is it fair to say that your stormwater management design for the proposed compressor station does not consider subsurface soil to constitute a land use with higher pollutant loads?
The stormwater management system has been designed to meet the level standard. So,
But you don't consider subsurface soil to be a level, correct?
I say that my opinion is that if you had a proposed land use of a disposal site, that would be considered a level. Given that we are a proposed natural gas compressor station, we are not a land use with higher potential pollutant loads.
So then I think you agree with what I said then, right?
Your question is confusing to me.
Okay, I'll just stop it. I think we've established your opinion.
Mr. Costa, if historic fill, not historic fill, does that make a difference to your design of the stormwater system? If the risk characterization is redone and changes, does that impact your stormwater system design?
No. So I've had discussions with the project's LSV, James Doherty, and I've reviewed the Algonquin Memorandum of Law, and they have stated that regardless of whether or not the project site is, and the fill is labeled as historic fill or not historic fill, that doesn't change the designation of whether or not the fill is considered solid or hazardous waste. If it was considered solid hazardous waste, infiltration would be restricted.
Okay, well, I understand what they've argued and what Mr. Doherty said. What I'm asking you is if the department is correct that it's not historic fill.
That does not change my design.
Thank you. Any further questions?